Hello, my dear friends, and welcome to this presentation entitled Communism and the Conscience of the West. And what it is a few audio highlights from Sheen's Catholic Hour broadcast in the year 1947. What Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen did for many years was he would take his radio addresses from his Catholic Hour presentations, and he would package them together into book form. And he did this almost every year that he was on the Catholic Hour, beginning in the early 1930s. And rest assured, you would always receive one or two new books presented by Archbishop Sheen, which were actually compilations of his addresses, and of course they are still very popular titles, still of course enjoyed today. And what I've done here is I've put together a number of his reflections from 1947, and these reflections were given under the series of talks called Light Your Lamps. And these reflections turned into the book Communism and the Conscience of the West, and it was published in 1948. And so I want to share with you a little bit of the audio from this very, well-received book, not just in the 40s, but even today, and it has been republished by our good friends at Tan Books. And so you could pick up a copy of Communism and the Conscience of the West today, wherever fine books are sold. But may I encourage you to go to the Tan Book website, and there you'll see a 5-book series called the Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen Signature Series. And this is one of these books. And so, again, I'm looking forward to just giving you a few highlights from the book, and I think you will get the message that Archbishop Sheen wanted to warn us about communism and, of course, teach us about the philosophies of communism. So, without further ado, may I share with you a number of reflections from the year 1947 from Fulton Sheen's Catholic Hour recordings. And we will begin with the first lesson called The Sign of Our Times. Please enjoy.
And now we are happy to bring you the Right Reverend Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen, who will deliver the first in a series of addresses generally entitled Light Your Lamps. Monsignor Sheen has chosen as the title of today's address, Signs of Our Times.
Friends, God love you. I want these to be my first words of greeting to you, as they will be the concluding words on each broadcast. God love you means God is love, God loves you, and you ought to love God in return. It is very difficult to do justice to this subject of communism each Sunday in the 16 minutes allotted to me in this 30-minute program. So this year I have written a much fuller treatment of each broadcast, which will be sent free to you if you write in your request. Why is it that so few realize the seriousness of our present crisis? Partly because men do not want to believe their own times are wicked, partly because it involves too much self-accusation, and principally because they have no standards outside of themselves to measure their times. Only those who live by faith really know what is happening in the world. And well may our Savior say to us what he said to the Sadducees and Pharisees in his time when they asked for a sign. When it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, there will be a storm, for the sky is red and lowering. You know then how to discern the face of the sky. Can you not know the signs of the times? Do we know the signs of our times? They point to two inescapable truths. The first of which is that we have come to the end of the post-Renaissance chapter of history, which made man the measure of all things. The three basic dogmas of the modern world are dissolving before our very eyes. First, we are witnessing the liquidation of the economic man, or the assumption that man, who is a highly developed animal, has no other function in life than to produce and acquire wealth, and then, like the cattle in the pastures, be filled with years and die. Secondly, we are witnessing the liquidation of the idea of the natural goodness of man. There was no need of a God to give him rights, or a Redeemer to salvage him from guilt, because progress is automatic, thanks to science, education, and evolution, which will one day make man a kind of God. We are witnessing also the liquidation of rationalism, or the idea that the purpose of human reason is not to discover the meaning and the goal of life, namely the salvation of a soul, but to devise new technical advances to make on this earth a city of man to replace the city of God. It may very well be that the historical liberalism of our modern generations is only a transitional era in history between a civilization which once was Christian and one which will be definitely anti-Christian. And the second great truth to which the signs of the times portend is that we are definitely at the end of a non-religious era of civilization. By that I mean one which regarded religion as an addendum to life, a pious extra, a morale builder for the individual but of no social relevance, and God as a silent partner whose name was used with a firm to give respectability, but who had nothing to say about how the business should be run. And the new era into which we are entering is what might be called the religious phase of human history. Do not misunderstand me. By religious, we do not mean that men will turn to God, but rather that the indifference to the absolute which characterized the liberal phase of civilization will be succeeded by a passion for the absolute. From now on, the struggle will not be for colonies and national rights, but for the souls of men. The battle lines are being clearly drawn. The basic issues are no longer in doubt. From now on, men will divide themselves into two religions, understood again as surrender to an absolute. The conflict of the future is between an absolute who is the God-man and an absolute which is the man-God. Between the God who became man and the man who makes himself God. Between brothers in Christ and comrades in Antichrist. But the Antichrist will not be so called. Otherwise he would have no followers. He will wear no red tights, nor vomit sulfur, nor carry a spear, nor wave an arrowed tail as Mephistopheles in Faust. Nowhere in sacred scripture do we find warrant for the popular myth that the devil is a buffoon who was dressed like the first red. Rather is he described as a fallen angel, as a prince of this world, whose business it is to tell us that there is no other world. His logic is simple. If there is no heaven, there is no hell. If there is no hell, there is no sin. If there is no sin, there is no judge. And if there is no judgment, then evil is good, and good is evil. But above all these descriptions, our Lord tells us that he will be so much like himself that he will deceive even the elect. And certainly no devil that we have ever seen in picture books could deceive the elect. How will he come in this new age to win followers to his religion? He will come disguised as the great humanitarian. He will talk peace, prosperity, and plenty, not as means to lead us to God, but as ends in themselves. He will write books on the new idea of God to suit the way people live, induce faith in astrology, so as to make not the will but the stars responsible for our sins. He will explain guilt away psychologically as repressed sex, make men shrink in shame if their fellow men say they are not broad-minded and liberal. He will identify tolerance with indifference to right and wrong. He will foster more divorces under the disguise that another partner is vital. He will increase love for love and decrease love for persons. He will invoke religion to destroy religion. He will even speak of Christ and say that he was the greatest man who ever lived. His mission, he will say, will be to liberate men from the servitudes of superstition and fascism, which he will never define. But in the midst of all his seeming love for humanity, his glib talk of freedom and equality, he will have one great secret, which he will tell no one. He will not believe in God. And because his religion will be brotherhood without the fatherhood of God, he will deceive even the elect. He will set up a counter-church, which will be the ape of the church, because he, the devil, is the ape of God. It will be the mystical body of the Antichrist that will in all externals resemble the church as the mystical body of Christ. In desperate need for God, he will induce modern man in his loneliness and frustration to hunger more and more for membership in his community that will give man enlargement of purpose without any need of personal amendment and without the admission of personal guilt. These are days in which the devil has been given a particularly long rope. Evil hour, when the shepherd may be struck and the sheep dispersed. Has the church made preparations for just such a dark night in the decree of the Holy Father outlining the conditions on which a papal election may now be held outside of the city of Rome? Men who know history have seen these dark days coming as far back as 1842, 105 years ago. Heine, the German poet, wrote, "Communism, though little discussed now and loitering in hidden garrets on miserable straw pallets, is the dark hero destined for a great, if temporary, role in the modern tragedy. Wild, gloomy times are roaring toward us, and a prophet wishing to write a new apocalypse would have to invent entirely new beasts so terrible that St. John's older animals would be like gentle doves and cupids in comparison. The gods are veiling their faces in pity on the children of men, their long-time charges. The future smells of Russian leather, blood, godlessness, and many whippings. And I should advise our grandchildren to be born with very thick skins on their backs." That in 1842. Well, indeed, may we be warned. For the first time in history, our age has witnessed the persecution of the Old Testament by the Nazis and the persecution of the New Testament by the communists. Anyone who has anything to do with God is hated today, whether his vocation was to announce his divine Son, Jesus Christ, as the Jew, or to follow him as the Christian. And because the signs of our times point to a struggle between absolutes, we may expect the future to be a time of trial for two reasons. Firstly, to stop disintegration. Godlessness would go on and on and on if there were no catastrophes. What death is to an individual that catastrophe is to an evil civilization. The interruption of life, and for the civilization, the interruption of its godlessness. Why did God station an angel with a flaming sword at the Garden of Paradise after the fall? If it was not to prevent our first parents from entering again and eating of the tree of life, which, if they ate, would have immortalized their guilt. And God will not allow unrighteousness to become eternal. He permits revolution, disintegration, and chaos to come as reminders that our thinking has been wrong, our dreams have been unholy. Moral truth is vindicated by the ruin that follows when it has been repudiated. The chaos of our times is the strongest negative argument that could ever be advanced for Christianity. Catastrophe reveals that evil is self-defeating and that we cannot turn from God as we have without hurting ourselves. And the second reason why a crisis must come is in order to prevent a false identification of the church in the world. Our Lord intended that those who were his followers would be different in spirit from those who were not. But this line of demarcation has been blotted out. Instead of black and white, there's only a blur. Mediocrity and compromise characterize the lives of many Christians. They read the same novels as modern pagans, educate their children in the same godless way, listen to the same commentators who have no other standard than judging today by yesterday and tomorrow by today, allow pagan practices to creep into family life, such as divorce and remarriage. There are not wanting so-called Catholic labor leaders recommending communists for Congress, or Catholic writers who accept presidencies in communist front organizations to instill totalitarian ideas into movies. There's no longer the conflict and the opposition which ought to characterize us. We are influencing the world less than the world influences us. There is no apartness. We who were sent out to establish a center of health have caught the disease and therefore have lost the power to heal. And since the gold is mixed with an alloy, the entirety must be thrust into the furnace, that the dross may be burned away. And the value of the trial will be to set us apart. Evil catastrophe must come to reject us, to despise us, to hate us, to persecute us, and then we shall define our loyalties, affirm our fidelities, and state on whose side we stand. Our quantity indeed will decrease, but our quality will increase. It is not for the church that we fear, but for the world. We tremble not that God may be dethroned, but that barbarism may reign. And 3 practical suggestions then for the times, as Christians realize that a moment of crisis is not a time of despair, but of opportunity. We were born in crises, in defeat, the crucifixion. And once we recognize that we are under divine wrath, we become eligible for divine mercy. The very disciplines of God create hope. The thief on the right came to God by a crucifixion. And secondly, Catholics ought to stir up their faith. Hang a crucifix in their home. Remind them that they have a cross to carry. Gather your family together every night to recite the rosary. Go to daily Mass. Make the holy hour daily in the presence of our Eucharistic Lord, and particularly in parishes where pastors are conscious of the world's need and therefore conduct services of reparation. And finally, Jews, Protestants, Catholics, Americans, all of us, must realize that the world is summoning us to heroic efforts at spiritualization. It is not a unity of religion we plead, for that is impossible when purchased at the cost of the unity of truth, but a unity of religious people, wherein each marches separately according to the light of his conscience, but strikes together for the moral betterment of the world. The forces of evil are united. The forces of good are divided. We may not be able to meet in the same pew. Would to God that we did, but we can meet on our knees. And you may be very sure that no sordid compromises nor carrying of waters on both shoulders will see you through. Those who have the faith had better keep in the state of grace. And those who have neither had better begin to find out what they mean. For in the coming age there will be only one way to stop your trembling knees, and that will be to get down on them and pray. Pray to Michael. Michael, the prince of the morning who conquered Lucifer, would make himself a god. When the world once cracked because of a sneer in heaven, he rose up and dragged down from the seven heavens the pride that would look down on the Most High. And pray too. Pray to Our Lady, and say to her, it was to thee was given the power to crush the head of the serpent who lied to men that they would be like unto gods. And mayest thou, who didst find Christ when he was lost for 3 days, find him again for our world that has lost him. Give to the senile incontinence of our verbiage the word. And as thou didst form the word in thy womb, form him in our own hearts. Lady of the blue of heaven, in these dark days light our arms. Give back to us the light of the world, that a light may shine even in these days of darkness. God love you.
Well, my good friends, I hope you enjoyed that first reflection from Archbishop Sheen, again about the sign of our times. And at the time of the recording, Archbishop Sheen was Monsignor Sheen. And of course, he was teaching at the Catholic University of America as a professor. And people look forward to his reflections each week. And so may I continue on this journey as we go through the book Communism and the Conscience of the West. And here we will now feature a reflection that Fulton Sheen, where he talks about the philosophy of communism. And again, you will agree with me, I'm sure, when this little segment is done, that you'll know a little bit more about communism. So again, I ask you just to sit back and relax and enjoy the wit and the wisdom of the Venerable Archbishop Sheen as he talks about the philosophy of communism. Please enjoy.
We present now the Right Reverend Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen, who delivers the third address in his series generally entitled Light Your Lamps. The title of today's address is The Philosophy of Communism.
Friends, I'm very grateful to the National Council of Catholic Men for making an exception today and allowing me 23 minutes to develop the philosophy of communism and its view of history, ethics, and religion. The communist attitude toward man we will discuss in another broadcast. And even fuller development of today's theme will be sent you free if you request it. I suppose it is safe to say that about 99 1/4% of the American people think that communism is just an economic system. It is not. Communism is a complete philosophy of life. What the Germans called a Weltanschauung, a total view of the world, different from all other secular systems, in that it seeks to dominate not only the economic periphery of life, but to control man's inner life as well, his intellect, his will, and his heart. Communism has a theory and a practice. It wishes to be not only a state, but a church judging the consciences of men. It is a doctrine of salvation, and as such claims the whole man, body and soul. In this sense, it is totalitarian. Last Sunday we told you that communism was Western in its origin, and today we will prove it. Communism had its origin in the brain of a German, Karl Marx, who was born of Jewish parents on the 5th of May in the year 1818 in the city of Treves, Germany. At the age of 6, Karl Marx, along with his family, were baptized and became members of one of the Christian sects, not for religious, but for political reasons. His mental development came from 3 countries. He took his philosophy from Germany, his sociology from France, and his economics from England. Our concern is with the first 2. The first stage in the development of his thought began at the age of 19, when he enrolled at the University of Berlin to study law, but in his own language to wrestle with the problems of philosophy. At that particular time, all the German universities were obliged to teach the philosophy of Hegel, who had died in the year 1831. Now, in order to understand the philosophy of communism, I have to bore you with this philosophy of Hegel for just a minute or 2. And bore is the word, for it is very difficult, and Hegel is responsible for a great deal of modern nonsense. Marx began studying Hegel and plunged into his almost unintelligible abstractions and intensified his study of the philosophy of Hegel that was known as dialectical idealism. Idealism, because it was concerned with thought, ideas, mind, spirit. Dialectical, because that was the method by which thoughts or ideas developed, namely by dialectics or debating or contradiction. For Hegel, there was no such thing as an unchanging truth. Ideas are fluid, and they are arrived at by a debating or dialectical process in which, like a tennis ball, they are batted back and forth over a net until finally a point is scored. First, there is the affirmation of an idea, then its negation by another idea, and finally a synthesis or a union of the 2. Suppose the problem under discussion was the decoration of a room. Here's an example of dialectics. One group says, let us do it in blue. Another group argues, no, green. And then finally, out of the conflict of ideas, there comes a synthesis of opinion, and one settles for red. Now, this I know is an oversimplification of the philosophy of Hegel, and if he heard me state it this way, he would probably turn over in his grave. But remember, it's often the business of philosophers to complicate and obscure the simple things of life. It's a very peculiar world in which we live, that when you are clear, people think you are simple. And when you are very confusing, people think you are learned or even a philosopher. Now, Marx was tremendously impressed with this dialectics of Hegel. In fact, so much so that in the year 1841, Marx presented to the University of Jena a doctoral thesis that was so dialectical in character that the second sentence contradicted the first, and the third united the first 2, and on and on and on. In this crazy piece of writing, Marx wrote, I hate all the gods. Now begins the second stage in the development of Marx's philosophy. The very year that he received his doctorate, 1841, there appeared the most popular attack on religion which had been delivered in Germany up to that time. While other Germans like Strauss and Bauer were trying to destroy Christianity through historical criticism, Ludwig Feuerbach, in his Essence of Christianity, try to destroy philosophy with materialism. Marx read his book, and he said his enthusiasm was unbounded. Feuerbach had killed the idealism of Hegel, which Marx never liked anyway, and destroyed all religion by showing that it was an illusion projected by the brain of man. And that pleased the irreligious Marx tremendously. Feuerbach did all this by denying that there was such a thing as thought, or idea, or mind, or spirit, and by affirming that the only thing in the world is matter. As Feuerbach put it, man is what he eats. Now that the gods are dethroned, Marx got what he thought was a brilliant idea. Would it not be wonderful, he thought, to take this dialectical method, which Hegel applies to ideas, and apply it to matter, or to history? Marx then patched the dialectics that he took from Hegel to the materialism that he took from Feuerbach, and out of that hodgepodge of dialectical materialism, there came the philosophy of communism. From now on, Marx would say, not ideas, but matter expands by contradiction, which he felt was at the very core of the universe. Hence, there's no need of God to explain matter, because matter is endowed with motion. It develops by shocks, opposition, clashes, struggles, catastrophes. The whole universe, said Marx, is dialectical or contradictory. Can't you see what is coming? Just suppose you change one word, dialectical, into revolutionary. What have you? Matter is revolutionary. So just as soon now as Marx begins to apply his ideas to society, he will say society is revolutionary. Where did he get that idea? Well, just as he stole his first idea from Hegel, stole his second idea from Feuerbach, so now he steals his third from Proudhon, who was a Frenchman. Marx had read and was tremendously impressed with a pamphlet that was written by a French printer, Proudhon, on the subject of property, to which Proudhon was trying to apply the dialectics of Hegel. And one night at the Paris lodgings of a famous Russian revolutionist, Bakunin, Marx met Proudhon and expounded to him dialectical materialism and his application to politics. Proudhon, the Frenchman, said to Marx, "Marx, you're a typical German. You're way up in the air with your abstractions. No one is interested in these problems. The big problem today," said Proudhon, "is economic, not political. It is social, not Hegelian." And he said to Marx, if you want to keep your dialectics, you had better begin applying it to property. And this Proudhon did by suggesting that perhaps capital was the affirmative side of dialectics, and that in its turn begot its negation, which was labor. Somewhere there ought to be a synthesis in which both would disappear. Marx called this synthesis communism. And where the Frenchman led, the German followed. Inspired by Proudhon, Marx now decided to apply his dialectics to history, as he had applied it once before to matter, and he came up with the idea that history is nothing but the story of class struggle or contradiction between those who own property and those who do not own property, or what we today would call capital and labor. If you have a private property system, said Marx, then you get a literature, an art, a philosophy, and a religion to support the iniquitous system. And these things are just like foam, said Marx, upon the bier of private property. Take, for example, the commandment, thou shalt not steal. How did that come into existence? Well, that's the concoction of capitalists, say the communists. They invented it in order to defend their ill-gotten goods. Doesn't it follow then that if you do away with free enterprise and private property, you no longer need morality and religion? How do away with private ownership and production? By violent confiscation of that property under the leadership of communists. Let Marx tell you. I am quoting him here verbatim. This will be done by revolution, in which the working class will use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state. It may be taken for granted that bloody conflicts are coming. Far from opposing so-called excesses and making examples of hated individuals or public buildings to which hateful remembrances are attached by sacrificing them to the popular rage, such examples must not only be tolerated, but their direction must ever be taken in hand. The arming of the workers with rifles and ammunitions must be carried out at once, and steps be taken to prevent the rising of the army which would be directed against the workers. The workers need not be misled by democratic platitudes about freedom. Their battle cry must be revolution in permanence. And that brings us to the communist theory of ethics. It has a negative and a positive side. Negatively, it denies that morality which is based on the eternal law of God and reflected in conscience, since it is not God, but economics which make morality. As Lenin put it, we deny all morality taken from superhuman or non-class conceptions. We say that this is a deception, a swindle, a befogging of the minds of the workers and peasants in the interest of landlords and capitalists. From a positive side, communism teaches that the end justifies the means. The needs of the revolution determine morality. Hence, whatever fosters the revolutionary overthrow of democracy or the violent dispossession of those who own property is a morally good act. Whatever hinders the revolution, such as a refusal to take orders from a dictator, or a refusal to think the way that you are supposed to think, is a morally bad act. That is the ethics of communism. Democracies do not seem to understand why communism extends a friendly hand to religion one year and then the next year persecutes it. Why it allies itself at one time to democracy and then at another time seeks to overthrow it. Why at one time it sides with the Nazis and then fights against them. This is very easy to understand if you know anything about communism. It happens that these contradictory attitudes were developed as techniques, each one being thought best at the time for furthering world revolution. Is there any limit to chicanery, duplicity, and deviltry? None. Absolutely none. I do not want you to take my word for it. I think perhaps I'd better quote Lenin at this point. He says, "It is necessary to use any ruse, cunning, unlawful method, evasion, concealment of the truth." And Stalin has the same idea. Dictatorship means nothing more nor less than the power which directly rests on violence, which is limited not by any laws or restricted by any absolute rules. And from ethics we pass on to the subject of religion. It is sometimes said that communism is not opposed to religion. Do not believe it. This is untrue. It may happen that communism will give the Orthodox Church a right to worship, provided it becomes an instrument of pan-Slavism for the communication of communism. But this conception and concession is for tactical purposes only and is granted at the cost of freedom of religion. Atheism and communism are as inseparable as a head and a body. Two statements of Marx prove it. Marx argues, man has been divorced from himself in two ways, by religion and by private property. Religion divorces a man from himself by subordinating him to God. Private property divorces a man from himself by subordinating him to an employer. It follows that if man is ever to be restored to himself, both religion and private property must be destroyed. That was why Marx contended that the transformation of society must begin with a criticism of religion. A statement of Marx that is not generally known, but which puts communism's attitude toward religion in a nutshell, is this. Now, this is Marx speaking. Communism begins when atheism begins. Let our educators and our legislators ponder well over that statement. Such is the philosophy of communism. I am not going to offer any criticism, none whatever, because I believe that I am talking to intelligent people who can immediately see all of its fallacies. You can also see that the philosophy of communism or dialectical materialism is nothing but a crazy quilt made up of patches of Hegel and Feuerbach and Proudhon, all sewn together to cover up the nakedness of Marx's own thinking. One might just as well try to make a living organism out of the head of an ox, the body of a canary, and the tail of a dinosaur as to try and make sense out of this intellectual stew. Note that there is not a single Russian idea in this whole philosophy of communism. Not a one. It is bourgeois, Western, materialistic, and capitalistic in its origin. It was a creature of its age and could never have arisen in the 13th or even the 18th century because the influence of Christianity then was too strong in the world. Only when the organism of the Western world began to weaken could the germ infect it. Well, if the intellectual origin of communism is Western, how did it ever get into Russia? The concrete way in which it became effective there in its final form happened during the First World War. Germany was anxious to save herself, and she felt that her cause could be helped if she could win Russia away from the Allies. One way of doing this was to start a revolution in Russia. Accordingly, the German General Staff tossed 31 revolutionists into a boxcar marked extraterritorial, attached it to a train leaving indirectly for Russia. In this boxcar was Vladimir Ulyanov, better known to the world as Lenin, who on arriving in Petrograd mounted an armored car and began preaching the revolution. There was something fitting about Germany assisting in the birth of communism in Russia. Germany had already given birth to the theory of communism, so now it would give birth to its practice. And Russia, in its turn, paid back its debt to Germany in 1939, when the ignominious treaty between the Nazis and the Communists was signed, which allowed the Nazis for 2 years to overrun Europe, and which proved that there is no radical opposition between Nazism and communism. Do not take my word for it. Take Molotov's, who on that occasion said, "Fascism is only a matter of taste, and our friendship has been sealed in blood." Unfortunately, it turned out to be the blood of Poland. Now we know from captured Nazi documents that in 1940 Russia was actually willing to join with the Nazis to gain the Dardanelles in the Middle East, and in 1943 it was ready again to sign a separate peace with Germany. So now, make up your minds. There are only 2 philosophies of life from which you can choose. Only 2. Philosophy of those who believe in God and those who follow anti-God, and each has its symbol. The symbol of the one is the clenched fist. It stands for hatred and for violence and for destruction. The one gesture that turns the hand of man, which was meant to be an instrument of art, into that which most closely resembles the claw of a beast. And the other symbol, the symbol of the folded hands. They cannot strike, for they were not made for offense. They cannot protect, for they were not made for defense. They can only imprecate, only pray. A carnal decade, 10 Gothic spires, aspiring heavenward for the souls of men. And by and through these folded hands, may the race of Cain be brought beneath the cross, where there is a man unfurled upon it like a wounded eagle. And through our charities and our prayers, may their clenched fists, as it were, open and release their hate. And then when hate has gone out of the world, those hands which were nailed by hate will detach themselves and fold themselves together, not in judgment, but in embrace, that all the world may know how sweet is the love of Christ. God love you.
Hello, my dear friends. I hope you enjoyed that reflection by Archbishop Sheen on the philosophy of communism. And again, these are audio recordings from the year 1947, Sheen's Catholic Hour broadcast. And these reflections were put into a book titled Communism and the Conscience of the West. And this book has been republished by our good friends at Tan Books, and they can be reached on the web by simply visiting www.tanbooks.com. And there you'll see the Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen Signature Series, and it's a collection of 5 beautiful books that of Sheen's works. He wrote close to 70 books, and so 5 of them are featured in this set. And today we're spending a little bit of time on the book Communism and the Conscience of the West. And so we're going to share with you now a third reflection, and I have to say to everyone, we're not going to go through every chapter of the book and every recording that Fulton Sheen gave in that series from 1947, but we're going to give you, of course, as much as we can, and you'll be, I like to say, a little bit more wise after this is done. And so this next reflection is Fulton Sheen sharing with us how to meet communism. And I think this is what we all want to know, is how do we interact with a communist or someone that has a communist philosophy. And yet Fulton Sheen will teach us that in this lesson. So please may I invite you to sit back and relax and enjoy the wisdom of the Venerable Sheen as he gives a reflection how to meet communism. Please enjoy.
We present now the Right Reverend Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen, who delivers the fifth address in his series generally entitled Light Your Lamps. The title of today's address is How to Meet Communism.
Friends, the burden of this broadcast is the practical problem: what a nation and a people can do to combat communism. Immediately there come to mind three ways in which it should not be done. First, not by name-calling and hate, for we cease to be children of the Heavenly Father by hating those who hate us. Secondly, communism should not be attacked on the grounds that it is opposed to liberalism or monopolistic capitalism, because from an economic point of view alone, all these systems are unsatisfactory. Thirdly, we are not to meet communism on the false assumption that if economic conditions were bettered, that we would have no communism. Communism is not an economic doctrine. It is a philosophy of life. Economic conditions were very good in the Garden of Eden, but Lucifer started his revolt there. And this brings us to 5 positive ways of meeting communism: the economic, political, social, educational, and spiritual. Communism can be met politically by choosing candidates in elections, not on the basis of political parties, nor on the basis of the economic class they support, but on the basis of the moral worth of the candidates. Namely, whether a candidate is a husband of one wife, whether he says his prayers, whether he refuses to follow a party line dictated from abroad, whether he believes we ought to live up to the Atlantic Charter, and whether he agrees with George Washington that religion and morality are essential for national life. A nation always gets the kind of politicians it deserves. If a time ever comes when the religious Jews, Protestants, and Catholics ever have to suffer under a totalitarian state which would deny to them the right to worship God according to the light of their conscience, it will be because for years they thought it made no difference what kind of people represented them in Congress, and because they abandoned the spiritual in the realm of the temporal. The economic way to meet communism is to make capitalists out of the workers by a wider diffusion of private property. Before suggesting how this can be done, a word about the morality of private property is necessary. It used to be, when property was real rather than financial as it is today, that the right to property was inseparable from responsibility. A man owned a horse. He could show a title to it. He could say, "It is mine." But the responsibility for the horse was also his. If the horse trampled the neighbor's garden, he had to remunerate the neighbor. But because he owned, controlled, and managed the horse, he was also entitled to 100% of the profits from the horse. With the development of finance, those two things which were meant to be joined, ownership and responsibility, became separated and divorced. Those who own today do not labor or manage, and those who labor or manage generally do not own. The stockholders are distinct from labor and management. Since the stockholders have surrendered responsibility, they have given up one of the essential notes of property, and hence one of the titles to profits. But the owners or stockholders still claim all the profits, though they have surrendered 50% of the title, namely labor and responsibility. The stockholders are only the passive creators of wealth. The active creators are the workers. For that reason, there should be a modification of the wage system so as to give the workers a share in the profits, management, and ownership of industry where they work. A fuller development of this particular theme will be sent you on request. There is no doubt as to which has the clearer title to profits. Certainly the man who clips coupons and sends in his postcard for a vote by proxy to the corporation is less entitled to the profits of industry than those who wipe sweat from their brows at the end of the day. I'm very happy to say that during this past week in Washington, I spoke at a meeting of a corporation and its workers where this suggested plan of mine of sharing profits with the workers was put into actual effect. Communism wants the dictator to own all the property. We want to share property with the workers. In terms of analogy, capitalism wants a few men to own all the hens, the workers receiving a few eggs for preparing the nest. The communist solution is putting all the hens and all the eggs in the hands of a dictator cook who makes an omelet, which is bound to be unsatisfying because not all the people like omelets, and most people do not like the way the dictator cooks anyway. And the Christian solution is to distribute the hens so that every man can cook his eggs the way he likes them, and even eat them raw, if that is his definition of freedom. By distributing a wide mass of property owners through the country, with their scattered powers, privileges, and responsibilities, one creates the greatest resistance in the world to tyranny, either political or economic. For just as a man is free on the inside, because he can call his soul his own, so he begins to be free on the outside because he can call property his own. Then property becomes what it was always intended to be, the economic guarantee of human liberty. The social way to meet communism would be by the appointment of chaplains in industry from each of the three faiths. There is no escaping the fact that once the individual enters into a new human relationship, and one at which he spends most of his day, almost his entire week, there is a specific need of ministering to him in that relationship and not apart from it. In order that the chaplain might better operate within an industry, he should build a church immediately near the factory, where labor, management, and capital could assist at morning mass and learn that all who eat one bread are one body. If men would get down on their knees together, there would be much less need of using fists against one another. But the chaplain's functions, of course, would go beyond the factory church, as the Army assigns a chaplain an office within the Army camp. So the industry should assign quarters for a chaplain in which he may be freely consulted at all times by labor and management. For there is no reason why the iron gates of a factory should prevent the modern worker from enjoying what the village blacksmith used to enjoy: accessibility to his rabbi, to his minister, and to his priest. The chaplain should receive no salary, no expense account, no money of any kind from either stockholders, management, or labor unions, in order that they may not be beholden to anyone. And the supreme value of industrial chaplains would be the organization of men on a non-competitive or spiritual basis. And then when the time came to elect labor leaders from the industry, the communists who thrive in vociferous minorities at late hours, when the decent people want to go to bed, would find themselves stalemated and checked by those who came out in great numbers to keep America American and their souls their own. Another way to meet communism would be to utilize our religious schools for adult education. These schools are in operation only about 6 hours a day. most of them closing at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It would seem in the present crisis advisable to use the late afternoon and evening hours for adult education. Among many subjects taught, there would be courses in religion, the training of labor leaders, courses on marriage, property, and the philosophy of peace. Through such courses, our people would learn that the alternative between right and left is not the same as right and wrong, and that the best way to make the world better is to make ourselves both better and wiser. Now, finally, there is the spiritual. Communism has an appeal to two classes, the simple and the frustrated. First, the simple or the naive believe that communism is interested in the workers and the poor. This appeal, however, does not last very long among the simple people once they come to know communism as it actually is. Then they reject it. That is why the Communist Party has such a rapid turnover, reaching as high as 40% within a few years. Toward these simple, deluded people, there must be, on our part, a recognition of their good instincts, and above all, their passion for social justice. Deluded though they are nevertheless unconscious and involuntary instruments of the Holy Spirit. Our task must be to educate them, for as their attachment to communism grows in ignorance, so it will decline with knowledge. But by far the greater appeal, however, of communism is to the disillusioned and the frustrated. This group becomes communist not because they are convinced that communism is right, but because they have a hidden hate against something or somebody. Individually, they feel impotent to vent their hate upon a person or a class or an institution, but believe that if they joined the party, they could find a corporate expression for their pent-up animosities and their dammed-up hate. Every frustrated, disillusioned, discontented soul, and every one who has lost his faith, is a potential member of the Communist Party. For example, those who started out with a great lust for wealth and never achieved it, or who became disappointed capitalists, will join the Communist Party to get even with the capitalists whose wealth they envy and whose property they one day want to possess. Those who have felt the sting of uncharitable fellow men who made fun of their race or color or nationality or refused to give them the hand of fellowship are also likely material for communism, not because communism can give them recognition, which it does not in practice, but only because these people get a chance to get even with those who are unkind. Those, too, who have never been able to think clearly flock to communism, where they have to do no thinking whatever, but where obedience to a dictator gives them the illusion of power. Those who became bored with life because of their anti-moral lives, which produce chaos in their souls, look for a communist dictatorship outside of themselves to organize their chaos. Those who lost the power of self-regulation from within through loss of virtue seek and impose regulation from without in the party. Those who lost the goal of existence, the purpose of life, invite a communist tyranny to impose a goal, to dictate a purpose. Those whose consciences bother them because of their sins or loss of faith become communists to persecute religion in a vain attempt to ease their loss of peace and God. And the supreme advantage of all of these hates is that they enable the frustrated and the disillusioned who join the party to combine the strongest affirmations for social justice with the most contemptuous disregard for individual justice and personal betterment. They could not become Christians, which they want really in their own heart, because Christianity would demand personal righteousness. But in communism, they have a seeming sense of righteousness and justice by hating the wrongs of others without any obligation to better their own lives. Now, what attitude should we take to these people? Well, above all else, no hatred. Rather start with the assumption that these disillusioned individuals are perhaps not so very far from the kingdom of God. As a matter of fact, they are much closer than the liberals and the indifferent, who have neither hates nor loves. Once they come to see that what they hate is evil and not an economic system, and what they are seeking is God and not their own miserable atheism, in which each one makes himself a God and me an atheist, they are at the very door of that peace that only Christ can open to them. We therefore must always make a distinction between the ideology and the person, between communism and communists. Communism is to be hated, as a doctor hates pneumonia in his sick child. But the communists are potential children of God, and they must be loved as the sick child is loved. A Christian who starts with the assumption that all communists ought to be annihilated or sent to concentration camps, which indeed they would do to us, is not worthy of the name of Christ. We are to seek not their extinction, but their transfiguration. Does God hate us because we are sinners? Then shall we hate them for being a particular brand of sinner? Was not Paul in the early church a greater persecutor of religion than Tito or Stalin or Hitler? There must have been thousands of Christians who had hoped that God would send a coronary thrombosis to Paul in order to take him out of this life. I'm sure the early Christians must have prayed that God would send someone to answer that fiery and zealous enemy. Send an apostle, they prayed, to answer Paul. Well, God heard their prayers, and God sent Paul to answer Paul. God's power is more manifested in conversion than in destruction, for he knows that the bitterest enemies make the best saints, and not those weak-minded brothers and sisters who hate communism only when their newspapers hate them. Communists will be brought to the democratic and the Christian way of life, not by argument, because communism is anti-rational. But they will be bought by prayer, by charity, by kindness. Some years ago, one of the editors of a communist newspaper wrote a series of articles against religion and its unworthy disciple. Now, what would you do in such a case? Challenge the editor to a duel? Given my physique, you would not. And then I was a Christian. So I invited the communist editor to dinner. The first thing he did was to say, now what we have against you is that you refuse to admit that Russia is a democracy. I said, how can Russia be a democracy in the light of Article 125 of the Soviet Constitution? He said, what is Article 125? My good man, I said, I did not invite you here to talk about communism. I invited you here to talk about your soul and the Blessed Mother. And I talked about the Blessed Mother for 1 hour. 9 years passed, in which there was a prayer every day for that man. He now no longer has to worry about following the party line. He is a free man. His name is Louis Boudin. And this, I think, is the real way to fight communism, by prayer. So may I ask you, Jews and Protestants and Catholics in my radio audience, to offer a holy hour of prayer a day for the peace of the world and for the spreading of the love of God. God love you.
Well, my dear friends, may I invite you to take up Archbishop Sheen's challenge to make the holy hour each day. And, you know, he made that request at the end of this broadcast you just heard, but he would do that every week on his radio broadcast. He would invite Jews, Catholics, and Protestants to pray 1 hour each day. And so may I invite you to take up that challenge and to pray a holy hour each day. My dear friends, there is a beautiful book that you can find on Amazon, and it's simply called The Holy Hour Prayer Book. And it's a prayer book that Fulton Sheen put together in the 1940s and shared with his radio audience. People would make requests for the book, and they would send it out to all those who asked. And this book has been republished, and it is one of those Amazon bestsellers. And so you'll just simply Google The Holy Hour Prayer Book by Fulton Sheen. You'll see a beautiful picture of the altar at St. Mary's Cathedral in Peoria, Illinois, and a picture of our Eucharistic Lord in the monstrance. And so, again, a great collection of meditations that so many people have enjoyed over the years, but I would strongly recommend that you pick up a copy of the Holy Hour Prayer Book. And I've been, of course, encouraging everyone to also pick up a copy of Communism and the Conscience of the West. And, of course, this book was penned in 1948 by Fulton Sheen, but has been re-released by our good friends at Tan Books. And their website is tanbooks.com. And there they have a signature series of 5 titles that Fulton Sheen penned over the years. And again, a great, I want to say, resource for any home. And I think this is what I've always said to people over the years is we need to read Fulton Sheen, listen to Fulton Sheen, and of course watch Fulton Sheen. And again, his videos are second to none. And there's actually a website that you can visit. It's called bishopsheentoday.com. And I think of, again, it's well named in that we need Bishop Sheen today. And so on that website, bishopsheentoday.com, there is close to, I think it is 200 videos that are made available to watch, hundreds of hours of audio recordings, and even a few free downloadable books. And so I love that word free. And I always think salvation is free. And it's nice to have free audio recordings, videos, and books at your the click of a mouse. And so may I invite you to visit bishopsheentoday.com. All right, we'll continue with some of these audio reflections from 1947. And our next talk that we'll feature is a talk that Fulton Sheen gave on communism and woman. And so, again, looking forward to sharing that with you. And so may I invite you, as always, just to sit back and relax and enjoy this very wise and holy man, the Venerable Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, as he gives this reflection titled Communism and Woman. Please enjoy.
We present now the Right Reverend Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen, who delivers the 6th address in his series generally entitled Light Your Lamps. Today, Monsignor Sheen speaks on the subject Communism and Woman.
Friends, 17 years ago today, we gave the first broadcast on the Catholic Hour. And inasmuch as we have dedicated all of these broadcasts to our Blessed Mother, it is fitting that today's subject, Communism and Woman, be treated with special reference to her. The proudest boast of communism is that it has finally emancipated woman by making her the equal of man at work. As Karl Marx, who was the founder of communism, wrote, differences of ages and sex have no longer any distinctive social validity. All are instruments of labor. The key word here is instrument, because it reduces a human being to the dignity of a monkey wrench. The communist assumption is that woman was free just as soon as she became available for economic production. One of the paradoxes of our irrational world is that today woman is glorified when she produces an atomic bomb which destroys life, but not when she produces life. It is like praising violinists for making sewer pipes instead of melodies. At the very beginning of the communist revolution in Russia, a decree was passed that all women between the ages of 17 and 32 became the property of the state, and the rights of husbands were abolished. The reference for this and other statements in today's broadcast will be sent you free if you write for the references. In keeping with the idea that liberation means working in a factory rather than in a home, we read in a Soviet book that was published in 1935, all the local communist organizations received orders to call up 6 million housewives and attach them to production. Many of the women refused to go, but they were forced into this emancipation. They began working in mines and sewers and in the manipulation of pneumatic drills. A few years ago, 23% of the miners of Russia were women. The Soviet poets composed ballads for the women to sing as they were liberated and went into work in the factories. Now, I know that this does not sound like poetry, but this is Soviet poetry. Formerly, women only knew how to cook soup and porridge. Now they go to the foundry. At the foundry, it is nicer. This idea of the emancipation of woman through industrialization is not altogether a communist idea, but like many others has been derived from our Western bourgeois capitalistic civilization, which thought of the liberation of woman in terms of equality with men. The two basic errors of both communism and a capitalistic liberal civilization on this subject are, first, women were never emancipated until modern times. Secondly, equality means the right of a woman to do a man's work. First, it is not true, as liberalism and communism assert, that women began to be emancipated only in modern times and in direct proportion to the decline of religion. The fact is that woman's subjection began after the 17th century with the breakup of Christendom and took on a positive form at the time of the Industrial Revolution. Under the Christian civilization, women enjoyed rights and privileges, honors and dignities which have since been swallowed up by the machine age. For example, in the Middle Ages, in the days of faith, 85 guilds in England there were, and out of the 85, 72 had women members on an equal basis with men. In Paris, there were 15 guilds reserved exclusively for women, and 80 of the Parisian guilds were mixed. Nothing is more erroneous historically than the belief that it was our modern age which recognized professional women. Up until the 17th century in England, women functioned in business perhaps even more than they do today. In fact, so many women were in business in those days that it was provided by law that the husband should not be responsible for her debts. Between 1553 and 1640, 10% of the publishing in England was done by women. Because the homes did their own weaving, cooking, and laundry, it has been estimated that women in pre-industrial days were producing half the goods required by society. In the Middle Ages, women were as well educated as men. And it was not until after the 17th century that women were barred from universal education. And then at the time of the Industrial Revolution, all of the activities of women were curtailed. And the machine took over the business of production, and man moved into the factory. Then came the loss of the legal rights of women, which reached its fullness in Blackstone, who pronounced women's civil death in law. And as these disabilities under liberalism and industrialism continued, woman felt the loss of her freedom. And rightly so, because she felt that she had been hurt by man who robbed her of her legal rights. She reacted, and she fell into the opposite error of believing that she ought to proclaim herself the equal of man in all things. And this equality was defined as absolute and unconditioned sex equality with men. And these ideas were incorporated into the first resolution for sex equality passed in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. And the resolution read, "Resolved that woman is man's equal, was intended to be so by the Creator, and the highest good of the race demands that she be recognized as such." Now this brings us to that second error of the bourgeois capitalistic communistic theory of women, namely the failure to make a distinction between mathematical and proportional equality. Mathematical equality implies exactness of remuneration. For example, two men who work the same job in the same factory should receive equal pay. Proportional equality means that each should receive his pay according to his function. In a family, for example, all the children should be cared for by the parents. But this does not mean that because 19-year-old Joan gets an evening gown with an organdy trim, that the parent should give 7-year-old Tommy exactly the same thing. Women, in seeking to regain some of the rights and privileges they had lost in Christian civilization, thought of equality in mathematical language. Feeling themselves overcome by a monster called man, they identified freedom and equality with the right to do a man's job. All the psychological, social, and other advantages which were peculiar to women were ignored until the inanities of the bourgeois world reached their climax in communism, where a woman was said to be emancipated the moment she went to work in a mine. And the result has been that woman's imitation of man and her flight from motherhood have developed neurosis and psychosis which have reached an alarming proportion in our modern civilization. The Christian civilization never stressed equality in the mathematical sense, but only in the proportional sense. For equality is wrong when it makes a woman a poor imitation of a man. Now she is man's mathematical equal, so he no longer stands when she comes into the room. He no longer gives her a seat in the bus. He no longer takes off his hat in an elevator. The other day in a New York subway, a man gave a woman his seat, and she fainted. When she was revived, she thanked him, and then he fainted. Now, wherein lies the solution to this problem of woman who has been a victim to man and a victim to the machine? The solution lies in a return to the Christian concept, wherein stress is placed not on equality, but on equity. There's a world of difference between the two. Equality is law. It is mathematical, abstract, universal, indifferent to circumstances and conditions. Equity is love, mercy, understanding, sympathy, charity. Now, applying this distinction to women, we are saying that equity and not equality should be the basis of her claims. Equity goes beyond equality by claiming superiority in certain aspects of life. Equity is the perfection of equality, not a substitute. It has the advantage of recognizing the specific difference between man and woman, which equality does not recognize. As a matter of fact, man and woman are not equal in sex. They are quite unequal. And it is only because they are unequal that they complement one another. The violin and the bow are not equal. That is why they produce music. Each has a superiority of function. Men and women are equal inasmuch as they have the same rights and liberties, the same final goal of life, and both have been redeemed by our divine Savior, but they are unequal in function. It is that truth which solves the problem. The Christian age has generally left law and justice to men and equity to women. They interpreted the Old Testament story of Esther to mean that God will reserve to himself the reign of justice and law, but to Mary, his mother, will be given the reign of mercy. During the Christian ages, our Blessed Mother bore a title which we rarely hear about today, and that is Our Lady of Equity. There is a statue to her in the Cathedral of Chartres in France. Stretching through the nave of the cathedral are two sets of priceless stained glass windows. One of these sets was given by the family of Blanche of Castile, the other by the family of Pierre de Dreux. Both families seem to carry on across the very heart of that cathedral a lovely kind of civil war, both interceding for their children. And over the main altar sits the Virgin Mary, the Lady of Equity, with the Holy Child on her knees, presiding over the court, listening serenely to pleas for mercy in behalf of their sons. This is woman's special glory: mercy, pity, understanding, intuition of human needs. Call it anything you please. It is equity and love in womanhood which will save a world wherein man's law and justice have broken down. Even our peace today is based upon the power of three nations rather than on the justice of God. And when shall come devotion to causes if women who are capable of greater devotion than men insist only on cold equality? How shall wars be stopped and the taking of human life if women, like men, trust only in law? But if women, in the full consciousness of their creativeness, say to the world, "It takes us 20 years to make a man, and we rebel against wars every generation, snuffing out the lives of those that have passed through the portals of our flesh," why, such an attitude would do more for the peace of the world than all the covenants and pacts based upon expediency and deceit. I repeat, it is equity and love that will restore a world wherein justice and law have collapsed. And the reason there is little love now is because in the human order, there's never any love between equals. There may be justice between equals, but no affection. If man is the equal of woman, then she has rights. But what heart ever lived on rights? All love demands inequality or superiority. The lover is always on his knees. The beloved must always be on the pedestal. Whether it be man or woman, the one must always consider himself or herself as undeserving of the other. Even God humbled himself in his love to win man, saying that he came not to be ministered unto, but to minister. And man in his turn approaches that loving Savior in communion with the words, "Lord, I am not worthy." The specifically feminine qualities are devotedness and creativeness. No woman is happy unless she has someone for whom she can sacrifice herself. Not in a slavish way, but in the way of love. And added to the devotedness is her love of creativeness. A man is afraid of dying, but a woman is afraid of not living. Life to a man is personal. Life to a woman is otherness. She thinks less in terms of perpetuation of self, and more in terms of perpetuation of others, so much so that in her devotedness, she is willing to sacrifice herself utterly for others, and she has a far greater capacity for sacrifice than man, to the extent that a career gives no opportunity for either. She becomes hardened. And if these qualities cannot be given an outlet in the home and the family, they can nevertheless find substitution in works of charity, virtuous living, and in the 7 corporal works of mercy. The level of any civilization is always the level of its womanhood. That is because there is a great difference between knowing and loving. In knowing something, you bring it down to the level of your own understanding. An abstract principle of physics can be understood by an ordinary mind only by examples. But in loving, we always go out to meet the demands of the one loved. If you love music, you have to submit to its laws and its disciplines. When man loves woman, it follows the nobler the woman, the nobler the love. The higher the demands by the woman, the more worthy a man must be. That is why woman is the measure of the level of our civilization. And it is for our age to decide whether woman shall claim equality in sex and the right to work at the same lathe, or whether she will claim equity and give to the world that love which no one else can give. In these pagan days, when women want to be only the equal of men, they've lost a great deal of respect. And to the Lady of Equity, therefore, we must all look once again, as even those who have the faith must see fulfilled in her those spiritual functions which no priest can ever perform: queen, mother, and woman. Christianity does not ask the modern woman to be exclusively a Martha or a Mary, but both, for that is Mary herself. She breaks the shell of woman's isolation from the world and puts woman back into the wide ocean of humanity, as she who is the cosmopolitan woman gives the cosmopolitan man, for which giving all generations shall call her blessed. Great men we need, of course, men like Paul, who with a two-edged sword will cut away the ties that bind down the energies of the world. Men like Peter, who will let the broad stroke of their challenge ring out on the shield of the world's hypocrisies. Great men like John, who with a loud voice will arouse the world from the sleek dream of unheroic repose. But we need women, too, to restore equity and love. Women like Mary of Cleophas at the foot of the cross, who will raise up sons who will hold white hosts in adoration of a heavenly Father. And women like Magdalene, who was also at the foot of the cross, who will take the tangled skeins of a seemingly wrecked and ruined life and weave out of them the beautiful tapestry of saintliness and holiness. And above all, women like Mary, who stood at the foot of the cross, that Lady of Equity, who will inspire others to leave the lights and glamours of the world for the shades and the shadows of the cross where saints are made. And when women of this kind return to save the world, not with equality, but with equity and love, then we shall salute them, not as the modern woman, once our superior, now our equal, but as the Christian woman, closest to the cross on Good Friday and first at the tomb on Easter morn. God love you.
Well, my dear friends, I hope you're enjoying this series of reflections from 1947. And even though these talks were given over 70 years ago, it's like they're still very relevant today. And this is the beauty of Fulton Sheen, is that this is timeless wisdom. Many people call him a prophet for our times today. And again, this is why I think so many people are paying attention to Archbishop Sheen, because his talks are ringing true today. And many of the things that he spoke about have come true. And so, again, we have to give him, I like to say, his due. And so I think we cannot go wrong, I think, by trusting this wise and holy man. Because I remember reading years ago, Fulton Sheen said there was two people that he trusted. Those who were older, of course the life experience, and those who had suffered. And when I think of those who had suffered, Fulton Sheen studied in Europe, and of course met many people who suffered under the communist regime. And so he knew firsthand what many of these people were going through, and of course what the evils of communism were. And so again, the warning call that he wanted to shout from the rooftops, and of course use the radio to get his message across. And I believe there was, I think it was 5 million people would listen to his broadcast each week, and so he did get the word out, that's for sure. All right, we will continue this series now, and this time we will have Fulton Sheen give a reflection titled Communism and the Family, where Archbishop Sheen will talk about the attitude towards the family in Russia and in America. And so many thoughtful insights will be contained in this reflection. So may I invite you to just sit back and relax and enjoy the wisdom of the Venerable Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen as we listen to his Catholic Hour presentation titled Communism and the Family. Please enjoy.
We present now the Right Reverend Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen, who delivers the 7th address in his series generally entitled Light Your Lamps. Today, Monsignor Sheen speaks on the subject Communism and the Family.
Friends, in this radio series up to the present, we've been rather critical of communism. It is now time for us to plead that America learn one of the most important lessons that communism has to teach us. It is not in the field of economics, because Russia has a very low standard of living. It is not in the domain of politics, because everywhere communism has taken root, it has repressed freedoms and created a slave state. But Russia can teach us much about the family. For here, Russia is now on the side of the angels. Curiously enough, on this subject, communism has been most successful at that point where it has most completely repudiated itself. It is most right where it has been most wrong. It has been most successful where it has admitted its greatest failure. Communism in the beginning set out to destroy the family, but without ever blinking even a red eyelid, it has now come to affirm in practice at least the Christian position of the family. In order to appreciate and understand this complete turnabout face of communist theory and practice, we ought first to consider communism's early attitude toward the family and then its present and changed position. The Communist Manifesto teaches that the family reposes on capital or individual gain, and states, therefore, that the family will disappear with capital. If there were any children from any unions, the state was to take charge of the education of the children. When Russia became communist and began to put this philosophy into practice, the communist theory of morality was known as the glass of water theory. As Madame Kollontai, the Soviet delegate to the League of Nations, put it, love is a glass of water one swallows to satisfy a thirst. You drink the water and forget the glass. So you enjoy the pleasure and forget the person. The matrimonial codes of 1918 and 1927 of Russia affirmed all children belong to the state. The Family Code of 1918 declared that all church marriages were invalid and could be dissolved at the will of either party simply by sending in a postcard to the registration office. The 13th Congress of the Communist Party even described the family as the formidable stronghold of all the turpitudes of the old regime. No reason was required for the separation of husband and wife, which broke down all distinction between legitimate and illegitimate children. The young were encouraged to spy on their parents and report them to the communist authorities at the least sign of fascism. Oh, incidentally, since a Russian communist journalist recently defined fascism as anti-communism, you have the tip-off on writers, journalists, and commentators. All who use that word anti-fascist now are either communists or fellow travelers. Well, inasmuch as the labor laws required that a person was obliged to accept any job that was given to him by the state, for under communism there's only one employer, and that is the state. It often happened that the husband was given a job in one city and the wife in another. The labor board settled this difficulty by decreeing that either spouse could find a partner in the new place of occupation. Abortion clinics were established by the state throughout the country, and every available means was used to weaken the family. And soon communist philosophy, which was already wrong in theory, because the family is not founded on capitalism, now began to prove itself wrong in practice. Russia began counting heads, or at least those that should have been heads. And lo and behold, in Moscow alone, only 57,000 children were born in 1934, while 154,000 abortions were performed. In the villages, there were 242,000 births, but 324,000 abortions. This ratio of 3-to-1 in favor of death was accentuated by divorces. One of the Moscow dailies, Izvestia, of July the 4th, 1935, stated, I'm quoting it verbatim, in Moscow in the first 5 months of 1935, there were 38% more divorces than registered marriages. In May, the number jumped to 44%. It is about time we declared that the frivolity in union is a crime, and that marital infidelity is an offense against the morals of a socialist regime. Homeless children were now roaming the streets, stealing, assaulting, killing. The wife of Lenin estimated their number at 7 million. So great was crime and juvenile delinquency that on April the 7th, 1935, the Council of Commissars, one of them being Molotov, decreed for certain crimes the death penalty for children 12 years of age and above. It could not be said that the vicious practices of these children were due to counter-revolutionary influences or capitalistic propaganda, for all of these children belonged to the generation that was born after the revolution. Now, because of these facts, at this point, the communists began to repudiate communism. As Lenin once saw that collectivism was wrong since it brought on starvation, and he gave a measure of private property back to the people, so now the Soviets see that the disintegration of the family is the disintegration of the nation. Every single social practice it once propagated, it now condemns, such as abortion, divorce, free love. The state now denies responsibility for children, affirms in its place parental authority. Novels begin appearing, such as The Third Front by Shubin, showing the evil effects of divorce and abortion, and reaffirming the maternal instinct, too long ignored and repudiated. The government-ordered conferences to be held everywhere, glorifying family life. The communist press that ridiculed marriage 15 years before now writes, and I'm quoting a Soviet newspaper, one of the basic rules of communist morals is the strengthening of the family. The right to divorce is not a right to sexual laxity. A poor husband and father cannot be a good citizen. People who abuse the freedom of divorce should be punished. And more startling still than this statement is the official journal of the Commissariat of Justice, which affirms the perpetuity of the marriage bond in these words: marriage is of positive value only if the partners see in it a lifelong union. So-called free love is a bourgeois invention and has nothing in common with the principles of conduct of a Soviet citizen. Moreover, marriage receives its full value for the state only if there is progeny, and consorts experience the highest happiness of parenthood. After this statement, the Soviet government in 1936 begins manufacturing wedding rings. Postcard divorces are abolished, Measures are taken to make divorce very difficult and rare. Fees for divorce are raised from 3 rubles to 2,000. And as the communist press states, and I quote it, silly girls will think it over twice before marrying a man with 20 or 30 divorce records. The so-called divorce distinctions, bourgeois distinctions, too, between legitimate and illegitimate children reappeared in Soviet law. Abortion clinics are abolished. Abortion becomes identified with homicide. Anyone counseling abortion is sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment. Articles appeared in the newspapers telling of its harmful effects. Children who under earlier communist regime were told to spy on their parents are now told, and I quote the Soviet newspaper, one must respect and love his parents, even though they are old-fashioned and do not like the young Communist League. These began to be paid to mothers with large families. Stalin began to have his pictures taken with children, and one day appeared in one of Moscow's gardens with his own children, the majority of Soviet citizens up to this time not knowing that he had any children. Further references on these points will be sent you free in an elaborated text if you desire it. And thus Russia, you see, after 20 years of communism in practice, rejects its entire philosophy of the family. But more important than this complete repudiation of its ideology is the fact that it has also repudiated the class as the unit of society. As the Soviet Constitution quotes sacred scripture without knowing it, it really does. It quotes St. Paul's epistle to the Thessalonians. So now communism, in its greatest defeat, proclaims the victory of the family over the class, the person over the proletariat, the fireside and the child over the hammer and the sickle. And that brings us to the point that we made at the beginning of this broadcast, that America ought to learn a great lesson from Soviet Russia. There is no doubt that today the philosophy of America regarding the family is almost the same as Russia's between 1917 and 1935. Namely, divorce, belief in it, free love, then a queer system which in a compound word rejects both birth and control. When the divorce rate in 30 major cities in our country is 1 divorce for every 2 marriages, when a nation has 520,000 divorces in 1 year, as we have, when in 1 city there are 5 divorces for every 6 marriages, there are unmistakable signs that America is rotting from within. It is now a firmly established fact that much of the neuroses and psychoses in modern woman is due to her fear of motherhood, her flight from the fulfillment of a high vocation to which God has called her. And the reason, too, for the instability of man is due to a flight from fatherhood. Divorce is an expression of unhappiness and is almost always preceded by a state of mental disequilibrium. 83% of the divorces in the United States come from marriages in which there are no children. Education is not the cure, because women with a college education are failing to reproduce themselves by 45%. And those with less education, high school graduates, are failing by 21%. What will happen to us if we continue to try to make a success out of that which Russia found to be a failure, namely the legalized decay of family life? Apart from all moral and religious considerations, 2 disastrous consequences will follow. First of all, we will become a nation of traitors. If we reach a state where 50% of the married couples feel that they can throw overboard pledged loyalty to homes in order to suit their own pleasure and convenience, then the hour is struck when citizens will throw overboard loyalty to country. When a Mrs. White is ready to call herself Mrs. Black, then it will only be a minute before Americans will be willing to call themselves Soviets. Let America beware. The traitors to the home today are the traitors to the nation tomorrow. And this is no idle talk about traitors, and perhaps even now, if it could be made public, we might discover a betrayal of national secrecy which would rival the Canadian story. But it should be no great surprise. A people who will not be loyal to a home will not be loyal to a flag. And secondly, the decline in family life is intrinsically bound up with decline in democracy. Here we understand democracy in the philosophical sense as a system of government which recognizes the sovereign worth of a man. But where in all the world is this dogma of man better preserved and practiced than in the family? Everywhere else, man may be reverenced for what he can do or for what he has. But in the family, a person is valued because he is. Existence is worth in the home, not possessions nor influence. That is why the crippled and the sick are given more affection in a home than those who normally provide for its subsistence. The family is the training school, the novitiate for democracy. And when men and women reach a point where they are no longer interested in watching a seed grow that they have planted or caring for its flower, when they can no longer see that more than the heady joys in each other's body is the thrill of seeing a life grow that they begot, when they are more concerned about increasing the ciphers in their bank account than obeying the primitive impulse to create and multiply, then know ye that a day has dawned when a thing is more important than a person. And then you prepare the way for a man who begins to be valued because of what he can do for a race, and that is Nazism, or a state, and that is fascism, or for a revolutionary class, and that is communism. In the family alone shall our citizens learn that there is other wealth than paper wealth, paper money, paper stocks, paper joys, namely the tingling, vibrating wealth of children, the unbreakable bond between husband and wife, the pledge of democracy, and the future heirs of the kingdom of heaven. From a natural point of view, and by natural I mean here, rooted in the eternal law of God, there is no doubt that family life is much higher in Russia than in the United States. Russia has stopped its disruption at the source, but we have not. There is every indication that our marital patterns will go on with increasing disorganization until marriages will be only shadows of real unions for life. It may very well be that Almighty God, looking down on the world, is smiling benignantly on the family in Russia. For like a repentant sinner, it is already in this one respect turned back to him. But he may be frowning on us for our pride in thinking that we can snap our fingers at his law and be strong and at peace. Our Lord once told the story of a father who sent two sons into the field. One said, "I go," but he went not. The other said, "I go not," but he went. We in America are like the first son. We say, yes, we go, we are Christian, and we read his gospel in church on Sunday. What God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. And then for 6 days a week we tear asunder that bond that symbolizes union of Christ and his church. And Russia, on the other hand, said, "I go not." But later on, it went. And for this was that son praised by the Lord. Our choice is very clear. There are two kinds of barbarism that we have to meet. Active barbarism from without, which is communism, and passive barbarism from within, which is the decay of our national life through the family. The second is more insidious. because history reveals that 16 out of 19 nations that have fallen from the beginning of Christianity have decayed from within. It is this passive barbarism from within which makes nations the prey to the active barbarism from without. Lincoln once said that he was never afraid of America being conquered from without, but he was afraid of it being rotted from within. And God in His mercy has granted to our generation a double incentive towards peace and order and prosperity. The first is His gospel, the second is Russia. His gospel teaches us that happiness will come if we live rightly. Russia teaches us the misery that will come if we live wrongly. At no other time in history has God so clearly marked His highways and His burnt out and washed out bridges. If you will not let Christ in the church teach you what is right, then please let Russia teach you what is wrong. And please God, as it is now teaching us that we were wrong in weakening the home, may it one day teach us that we also are wrong in forgetting our God. And to the hastening of that day, may I ask that all our listeners who know the Rosary will recite it daily for the conversion of Russia. God love you.
Well, my dear friends, I have to say that that was one of the most powerful and sobering reflections that I've heard Fulton Sheen give when he talks about the family and, again, the troubles facing the family. So, again, I think everything he said rings true even today. And so, again, you may want to replay that talk at a later time. But this is the beauty of these recordings. They are available for us to enjoy, and may I invite you once again to visit the website bishopsheentoday.com, and there is an archive that is second to none, programs done even going back into 2012, and so I've been able to share Fulton Sheen's recordings on the radio in Canada, in the United States, since 2012, and you can listen to a weekly broadcast that I put together on Radio Maria. And of course, the Radio Maria family is all over the world, and so you could tune in to Bishop Sheen Presents at Radio Maria USA and Radio Maria Canada. And of course, in the future, we hope to be on Radio Maria Australia. And of course, wherever, again, people appreciate Bishop Sheen, we hope that they will be, of course, listening through the Radio Maria network. And so, again, this idea of listening to Sheen and downloading his talks, you can do that at bishopsheentoday.com. And if you want to drop me a line, you can do that too. Of course, I've been active in promoting the cause of Archbishop Sheen's canonization, and have been involved with the good folks in Peoria, Illinois, sitting as a member of the board of directors there for the Fulton John Sheen Foundation. So the good Lord has me busy out in His vineyard sharing the wit and wisdom of Archbishop Sheen. And so again, that website, bishopsheentoday.com. And may I remind you that much of the content that you've been listening to is contained in the book Communism and the Conscience of the West, and it has been republished by our good friends at Tan Books, and you can visit their website at tanbooks.com. All right, we will continue, have a few more reflections to share with you. This next one is called Communism and the Revival of Passion. And again, we are trying to give you a good idea of what's contained in this book and how important it is for people to have a copy and to understand the evils of our time. And communism is with us today. And again, I think when we look at the political sphere, or we can almost just say, almost look into our neighborhoods and our local politics, sometimes we see those influences of communism and Marxism and what Sheen would refer to as the isms in society. So who better to teach us how to spot communism when we see it than Archbishop Sheen? And he did it with great passion. And so I think this title of this talk will get us very interested. So may I invite you to sit back and relax now as Fulton Sheen will give again another talk in his series from 1947 called Light Your Lamps. And this one is titled Communism and the Revival of Passion. Please enjoy.
We present now the Right Reverend Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen, who delivers the 8th address in his series generally entitled Light Your Lamps. Today, Monsignor Sheen speaks on the subject, Communism and the Revival of Passion.
Friends, everyone must admire the zeal and the sacrifice and the fire of communists in spreading their philosophy of life. There is no doubt that they show more spirit in trying to start a world revolution than we do in trying to prevent it. Whence comes this passion, and how did we lose ours? These questions we hope to answer in this broadcast. About the only time we ever hear the word passion now is in a movie or a modern novel. But passion was once something real in the world. It was born on the fringes of the Roman Empire, on a hill called Calvary, and on a Friday called Good. That passion was fire, and love and enthusiasm, showing itself first as tongues of fire on Pentecost, and then as martyrdom, mysticism, missionary activity, and as an apostolate that swept off the world the Greek ideal of moderation and Roman indifference to the truth. And from generation to generation, this torch of passion was passed on, until today there are millions who so love their Lord that all the blandishments of earth could not make them turn from that possession which makes all other possessions vain. This passion made some want to give everything to the divine lover, and thus was born the vow of poverty. It also inspired the young to give the best they had, and since the best was not of their body but of their souls, there was born the vow of chastity. It inspired others to dispossess their own wills, so as to be identified with the will of the one loved, and thus was born the vow of obedience. And that love of God which Thompson called passionless passion, wild tranquility, still continues to dominate a few of the faithful. But as far as the world is concerned, passion has passed out of existence. Our fires have gone out. There's no more zeal. There is only broad-mindedness, which is considered the greatest of all virtues. The man who cannot make up his mind about anything is called broad, and he who has discovered a few principles to guide his life is condemned as narrow. Tolerance has degenerated into indifference, and today it is generally held that it makes no difference what you believe. Right and wrong, truth and error have equal rights. We trot out Christ and Barabbas and allow a vote to determine which is innocent. There's no need then of counting the ballots once you allow people to choose between good and evil. Justice will always be sent to death. G. Studdard Kennedy compared our Lord coming to Golgotha and coming to the modern, broad-minded city of Birmingham in England. When Jesus came to Golgotha, they hanged him on a tree. They drove great nails through hands and feet and made a Calvary. They crowned him with a crown of thorns. Red were his wounds and deep. for those were crude and cruel days, and human flesh was cheap. When Jesus came to Birmingham, they simply passed him by. They never hurt a hair of him. They only let him die. For men had grown more tender. They would not give him pain. They only just passed down the street and left him in the rain. Still Jesus cried, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." And still it rained, the winter rain that drenched him through and through. And when all the crowds had left the streets without a soul to see, then Jesus crouched against a wall and sighed for Calvary. Yes, the crucifixion was more bearable than broad-mindedness, which was neither hot nor cold, and therefore which God said he would vomit from his mouth. But think not that the world could long live without fire and passion. Why did Europe at the close of the First World War adopt Nazism, fascism, and communism? Brown, black, and red fascisms never could have engulfed Germany, Italy, and Russia if they did not have some basic appeal and did not satisfy a long pent-up yearning. The Western man might go on with his indifference to religion. It is not a stable condition. Tolerance will give way to cynicism, and cynicism to persecution. No civilization can remain long indifferent to religion. Eventually, men will either love it or hate it. And the Nazis, the fascists, and the communists made the decisive steps. They were not faint-hearted. If the Western world would believe in individual atheism, they would be bold enough to make atheism official and put it into practice. It was a revolt against the half-hearted materialism in the name of total materialism. The only difference between these three forms of totalitarianism was that the Nazis absorbed the person in the race, the fascists in the nation, and the communists in the class. All three systems represented revolts against the disintegration of the world. And never will we be able to understand our times if we naively think of these systems as the work of a few gangsters or the creation of a pack of criminals. The appeal of Nazism, fascism, and communism was principally negative. They were protests against a milk and water liberalism, a spineless indifference to causes, a failure to recognize that nothing was evil enough to hate, and nothing was good enough to die for. The people of Europe wanted something they had lost in losing their faith. They wanted a faith, a religion, a belief and an absolute. They wanted dogmas, infallibility, discipline, authority, obedience, and sacrifice. They wanted to relieve the boredom that came from a false sense of freedom or license, so they flocked to a dictator. They wanted a compulsory organization for the chaos resulting from liberalism, which judged progress by the height of the pile of discarded moral inhibitions. They wanted pilgrimages, and since they wrecked the Church of the Virgin, they would make them to tractor factories. They wanted to believe there was something evil in the world. For some it was the Jew, for others the capitalists, for others Christians, for others Parliament, but at least it made them feel that life had a purpose and that sacrifice could be made for the sake of the party or the class or the nation by receiving a bullet in the back. Passion returned. Fires burned again. Though it was a passion for a vague collectivity, which Moloch-like canceled out personal dignity, disqualified all moral values, and denied all celestial loyalties. And totalitarianism, and particularly communism, gave the European man a religion, a counter-church to supplant a church, a faith to fight a faith, the inspired gospel of Marx for the abandoned gospel of Mark. Germany, Italy, and Russia were right in wanting a change. They were wrong in their solutions. The prodigal son was right in being hungry. He was wrong in living on husks. And that terrible void which filled Europe with totalitarian systems at the close of World War I now exists in the victorious nations at the close of this war. Why is the American youth inclined to be revolutionary? Not for a bad reason, I tell you, but for a good one. Our youth wants an absolute to take the place of the relative. It sees the inconsistency between sitting in a classroom and hearing a professor say that there's no distinction between good and evil, and then being inducted into the armed services to die because there is a distinction between good and evil. They see that life is vain if they have to go on through the night as sleepwalkers striking matches, while the rest of the world is lighting torches. Very simply, modern youth wants what Europe wanted at the close of the last World War: passion, fire, faith, enthusiasm. And our civilization today is in the state described by our blessed Lord in the parable of the empty house. We have driven the Nazi devil from the house of Europe. But because God in his justice did not occupy that house, 7 other devils worse than the first have come to dwell there. We are ill prepared to meet this new evil passion, because we of the Western democracies have no faith, no philosophy of life, no common purpose. We knew what we hated when we went to war, but we cannot agree on what we ought to love now that the war is over. Our emptiness makes us a prey to communism. We are apt to take it as an alcoholic will take an extra drink to put him on his feet. Communism fills the void, though it fills it as a vulture might fill the nest of a robin. Communism would never have had an appeal in any other age when people were Christian. And if it appeals now, it is because though we have turned from the divine light, we have not lost the need of it, but like moths burn ourselves in the tiny flame of totalitarian candles and firebrands. How shall this passion, this fire, and this enthusiasm for the new religion of communism be met? Very simply by recognizing that a passion can be conquered only by a passion. It takes a divine faith to meet a totalitarian faith, a philosophy of life to combat a philosophy of life, a total religion to conquer a totalitarian anti-religion. At the present time, all that we of the Western world have to offer against this new passion is a change in editorial policy, a shift in national moods as revealed by a Gallup poll, and an occasional change in a cabinet member. Why is it that our diplomats have been helpless before the exponents and the apostles of this new passion? Certainly not because they are wanting in a desire to perpetuate decency, order, and freedom in the world, but simply because their position has been illogical from the beginning. They and all of us of the Western world have been attempting to preserve the fruits of Christianity after having surrendered the roots. And this cannot be done. We are trying to preserve respect for the dignity of man, human freedom, the inviolability of human rights, after having surrendered a belief in God who gives man a dignity and who alone is the source of those rights. The position of communism is stronger. It says you deny the fruits of Christianity. Why not, therefore, with us reject the basis too? What shall be our answer? Well, the situation resolves itself down to this. Communists have the zeal, but no truth. We have the truth, but no zeal. They have the heat, but no light. We have the light, but no heat. They have the passion, but no ideals. We have the ideals, but no passion. Neither of us is right. They sin against the light. We sin against love. It is we who claim to be Christians. It is we who claim to believe in the existence of God and the moral law, and who nevertheless act not out of these beliefs, who are to be condemned. Our crime is our unfulfilled Christian duty, our sprinkling the fires of passion with the cold waters of indifference, our mediocrity, which blinds us to the fact that the day of broad-mindedness is over and that all humanity today is in search of a soul. And whence, it may be asked, comes this passion of communism for evil, for destruction, for violence, and for sacrifice? The answer is, these enormous sacrifices on the part of communists are possible only because of the Christian influence still left in the world, and because the shadow of the cross still falls across their path. Their passion is real only because they have caricatured the passion of our Lord, who laid down his life for love of us. If this anti-religious passion of communism ever succeeded in blotting Christianity out of the world, which is impossible, then communism itself would be impossible, for it would no longer be able to interpret service in terms of a higher purpose. No longer would it have a great passion to imitate, no longer a great love to pervert. Their anti-religious fervor comes only from religion. Their blind obedience is a parody on submission to divine truth. Their atheism would be silly if there were no God, for they would all be like Don Quixotes dueling with imaginary windmills. It is only the reality of God which gives fire to their atheism. They would be crazy if God were a figment of the imagination, but they are not crazy because they are fighting against something just as real as the thrust of a sword or an embrace. And the truth of this statement is borne out by the fact that as communism succeeds in destroying religion in any one country of the world, all of the communists lose enthusiasm. They settle down as spineless capitalists in czarist palaces, fulminating against capitalism from their ivory towers. It is the reality of Christianity which makes sense of their anti-Christianity. For their devil, the devil himself, would not be so busy if there was no God. There's no salvation against communism, therefore, unless we step out of our lethargy, our indifference, and re-enkindle in America the fires of religion. And what I have said before, I repeat. Communism will not be overcome, first, by defending capitalism. Second, it will not be overcome by hate and a purely negative or anti-communistic attitude. For how can we be against something unless we are for something? And thirdly, communism will not be overcome by any economic readjustment. For communism is not an economic system, but a philosophy of life that is bent on destroying the last vestiges of freedom in the Western world. And least of all, communism will not be destroyed by going to war against it. For communism thrives on chaos as disease thrives on dirt. But it will be overcome by a rebirth of passion for God and love of neighbor. Karl Marx once said, "Where atheism begins, there communism begins." That means that every capitalist, every hater of communism, every economist and politician who is opposed to communism, who this day has failed to worship God and increase the love of neighbor in his heart, has made his contribution to communism. Remember, there's nothing that ever happens in the world that does not first happen in souls. I tell you, and I have never been more earnest in my life, we had all better get back again to God. What can you do? Well, if you are a Catholic, you can offer yourself to your parish to spend a holy hour with your fellow men in all-night adoration of our Lord in the Eucharist in reparation for the sins of the world. How many pastors who are listening to me now are willing to start nocturnal adoration? Before such love, communism will evaporate as fog before the sun. And if you are a Jew or a Protestant, then you can spend an hour a day in prayer according to the light of your own conscience. A great crisis is upon us, and we cannot, like the apostle in the garden, substitute action for prayer by drawing swords. This is the answer to what can I do? You can pray. And these prayers that I am asking you to say an hour a day will leap across space and time and appear in other minds and other hearts and other lands. As our Lord said, what you whisper in secret shall be shouted from the housetops. Today it is only a prayer. Tomorrow it will be a shout of joy. And the day after tomorrow, the return of peace to the world in the glorious rebirth of the passion of divine love. God love you.
Well, my dear friends, I hope you have been enjoying these reflections from the Catholic Hour broadcast in the year 1947. And many of these reflections were put into the book Communism and the Conscience of the West. And I am happy to say that it has been republished by our good friends at 10 Books and is available for purchase. And so, again, a very handsome hardcover edition, which will be a welcome addition to your own personal library. And they can be found at the website tanbooks.com. I want to also invite you to listen to our weekly radio show, Bishop Sheen Presents, heard on Radio Maria Canada and Radio Maria USA. And, of course, you can find the podcast on all those social media outlets, Apple, iTunes, Podbean. The list continues to grow every week, it seems. So, again, look for the show Bishop Sheen Presents. And again, I want to share this last reflection now with you. It's titled Russia and Our Lady. And, of course, being on Radio Maria, it is, again, a lot of focus on the Blessed Virgin Mary. And so, of course, I love how Fulton Sheen dedicated all of his broadcasts to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And all of his books have beautiful dedications to the Blessed Virgin Mary. So I think it's appropriate that we end with this last reflection titled Russia and Our Lady. Please enjoy.
We present now the Right Reverend Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen, who delivers the 10th address in his series generally entitled Light Your Lamps. Monsignor Sheen speaks on the subject Russia and Our Lady.
Friends, last week we spoke of our deep affection for the Russian people and our hope that the predictions of the Russian writers of the 19th century would be verified. Namely, that Russia, after having been communistic for a brief time, would be converted and would sit at the feet of Christ and learn his gospel. Today we renew that hope, and for stronger reasons, as we speak of the revelation of Our Lady concerning Russia and the world. To understand its background, quickly glance over the world and see what is happening in 3 cities on the 13th of May, 1917. America had just shortly before entered the World War on Good Friday of that year. Rome, May 13th, 1917. Benedict XV imposed hands on Monsignor Eugenio Pacelli, making him a successor of the apostles. As the bells of Rome were ringing out the midday Angelus, a new bishop was given to the church, who one day, by the hidden designs of providence, would ascend the throne of Peter and govern the universal church as our Holy Father Pius XII. Moscow, May 13th, 1917. Maria Alexandrovich was teaching catechism in one of the churches of Moscow. She had 200 children before her in the pews. There was a loud noise at the front door. Horsemen entered, charged down the middle aisle of the great church, vaulted the communion rail, destroyed the altar, then rode down the side aisles, breaking the statuary, and finally attacked the children, killing some of them. Maria Alexandrovich ran out of the church screaming. It was the first of those sporadic outbursts that foretold the coming communist revolution. She went to one of the revolutionists, who later on became very famous, and screamed at him, "The most terrible thing has happened. I was teaching catechism in the church. Horsemen entered, came in, destroyed the church, charged the children, and killed some of them." Lenin answered, "I know it. I sent them." Fatima, Portugal, May 13th, 1917. 3 children from the parish of Fatima, Hasina, Francisco, and Lucy, were attending their flock. The Angelus bell rang from the steeple of the nearby church. These 3 little shepherds knelt down and, as was their daily practice, recited the rosary together. When they finished it, they decided to build a little house which would shelter them in stormy days. But these little architects were suddenly interrupted by a blinding flash of lightning. They looked anxiously at the sky. Not a single cloud veiled the brilliance of a noonday sun. They ran, and just 2 paces ahead of them, in the midst of the foliage of an evergreen oak, they saw a beautiful lady, more resplendent than the sun. With a gesture of motherly kindness, the lady said to them, "Fear not. I shall do you no harm." The lady was very beautiful. She appeared to be between 15 and 18 years of age. Her hands are joined at the height of her breast in an attitude of prayer. A rosary of brilliant pearls with a silver cross hangs from her right hand. Her face of incomparable beauty shines in a halo as bright as the sun. But there seems to be, however, a slight look of sorrow. Lucy is the first to speak. "Where do you come from?" "I come from heaven," replied the lady. "From heaven? And why have you come here?" "I have come to ask you to come here for 6 months in succession. In the month of October, I shall tell you who I am and what I want." Of the 6 appearances of the Blessed Mother to these children, the most important one was the apparition of July 13th that year. It must be recalled that this was the 3rd year of World War I. And speaking of World War I, she said this war is going to end soon, and if people do penance, many souls will be saved and the world will find peace. But then she considers the possibility that men will not do penance, and there will be a danger of a 2nd World War. She said, if people do not cease to offend God, not much time will elapse, and precisely during the next pontificate, another and more terrible war will have its beginnings. As a matter of fact, it was during the pontificate of Pius XI that the terrible Spanish War took place, which was a prelude to World War II. And during that time, the Reds, in their hatred of religion, massacred 13 prelates, 14,000 priests and religious, and destroyed 22,000 churches and chapels. And the Blessed Mother then gave a sign to the children as to when World War II would actually begin. And after that sign was given, Lucy said, "It will be horrible, horrible." Now it must be remembered that all the chastisements of God are conditional, and they can be averted by penance. The Blessed Mother, it is to be noted, said that World War II could be avoided. For she added, "To avoid this second world war, I ask for the consecration of the world to my Immaculate Heart and communion in reparation the first Saturday of each month. If my requests are granted, Russia will be converted. There will be peace. Otherwise, Russia will spread its errors throughout the world, giving rise to wars and persecutions against the Church. The good will suffer martyrdom, and the Holy Father himself will suffer much. Several nations will be destroyed." At this point, the Church has seen fit not to give us the part of the message that follows. What that particular message was, we do not know. It apparently is not good news, and it would seem to refer to our times. In any case, we are given the conclusion of the message, which is one of hope and joy. The Blessed Mother concluded, "But in the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart. Russia will be converted, and an era of peace will be given to the world." The final revelation took place on the 13th of October, 1917, when the Blessed Mother promised to work a miracle that would, to all present, convince them of the truth of her apparitions. On the evening of October 12th, all the roads to Fatima were packed with carriages, bicycles, and pilgrims on their way to the apparition. A crowd of 60,000 gathered, many of them unbelievers and scoffers. Lucy asked the people to look at the sun. The rain ceases, and suddenly the clouds open wide, exposing an immense surface of blue. Suddenly the sun trembles, makes some abrupt movement, finally begins to turn giddily on itself like a wheel of fire, casting in all directions great beams of green, red, purple, yellow, and blue, coloring in a most fantastic manner the clouds, the trees, the rocks, and the earth. Amidst that crazy dance of fire and colors, like a gigantic wheel which from its spinning had swung out of its axis, the sun leaves its place in the firmament, and falling from side to side, plunges zigzagging through the heavens as if it would crash upon the crowds below. And then from this terrified crowd, there suddenly escapes a terrible cry, and a men shout, praying with the religious terror of souls preparing seriously for death, professing their faith and asking God's pardon for their sins. With one accord, falling on their knees in the mud, the spectators recite it in a voice choking with sobs, the most sincere act of contrition that has ever come from their hearts. And finally, stopping short in its mad fall, the sun climbs back to its place, zigzagging as it had come down, and ends by gradually regaining its usual brilliance in the limpid sky. Though every one had been drenched with rain throughout the morning, immediately after the apparition, everyone's clothes were perfectly dry. I'm not here concerned about proving the authenticity of these revelations to you, for those who believe in the realm of the Spirit and the Mother of God need no proof, and those who reject both would not accept the proof anyway. But what significance should we attach to the apparent fall of the sun upon the people of Fatima on that October day, 1917? We have no way of knowing for certain, but since its general effect was so frightening, we may speculate. Could it augur the day when men would steal some of the atomic energy from the sun and use it not to light a world, but as a bomb to thrust down from the heavens upon a helpless people? It used to be when famine was stalking the earth, and while war was devastating the accumulated heritage of the centuries, that men could look to the skies for hope. If this earth was cruel, at least the heavens would be kind. Did this apparition portend that now even the heavens for a time would turn against man, and its fires would be released upon the helpless children of God? Whether or not it was a premonition of the atomic bomb, we know not. One thing is certain. We shall still not lose hope. And amidst all the clouds, we can still look up to the heavens to see the lady with the moon beneath her feet, the stars a crown about her head, and the sun above her. The heavens are not against us, and will not destroy us, while she reigns as the Lady of the skies. Divine Providence has committed to her the power of overcoming evil and averting the danger of another world war. Our reason for saying so is this. In that first dread day when evil was introduced into the world, God spoke to the serpent in the Garden of Eden and said, I shall put enmity between thee, the serpent, and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. And thou, the serpent, shalt lie in wait for her heel. It will be through the power of a woman that evil will be overcome, said the Lord. We live now in an evil hour. Goodness has its day, but evil has its hour. Our blessed Lord said that much the night that Judas came into the garden. And the Savior said to him, this is your hour. And the power of darkness. All evil can do in that hour is to put out the lights of the world. But it can do that. If then we live in a day when the devil has been given a particularly long rope, how shall we overcome the spirit of evil except by the power of that woman to whom Almighty God has given the commission to crush the head of the serpent of evil? Therefore we trust in her and in her intercession. How can another world war be averted? It is certain that politics cannot stop it. For by abandoning the Atlantic Charter, we have sown the seeds of another war. Equally certain it is that no economic, social, or military plan can stop it, for the danger of war exists so long as people are godless and selfish and acquisitive. The world's only hope is in a miracle. Only God can stop it. The answer to Russia is not war, but conversion. And if Russia ever received again the gift of faith, it could lead the whole world to peace. Think for a moment of what a transformation a single revelation of our Blessed Lady would work among the 176 million Russians who do not belong to the Communist Party and who cannot belong to it. Mexico was converted through a revelation of Guadalupe. Pagan Rome was converted after it persecuted the church for 300 years. And atheistic Russia is no less beyond the power of God's grace than Rome. We must therefore pray that Russia receives the gift of faith. And Catholics, for that reason, ought to say the rosary every day for Russia and receive communion the first Saturday of each month for the intention of Russia. Before this miracle will come to pass, there has to be a greater social manifestation of love for God through devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Our Blessed Mother asked for the consecration of the world, and the Holy Father, on the 25th anniversary of his episcopal consecration, and on the 25th anniversary of the Revelation of Fatima in 1942, did consecrate the world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. We now await the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, not only by the Holy Father, but also by the bishops of the Church. And in conclusion, as Americans, we are very proud of how our recent history has been tied up with the feasts of Our Lady. We who have the faith cannot forget that on December the 8th, 1846, just 100 years ago, the Council of Baltimore consecrated the United States to the Immaculate Conception of our Blessed Mother. It was on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, 1941, that the United States went to war with Japan. It was on May 13th, 1945, when the entire church celebrated Sodality Day of Our Lady throughout the world, that the United States government proclaimed a national thanksgiving for V.E. Day. It was on August the 15th, 1945, the feast of the Assumption of our Blessed Mother, that victory came to us in the war with Japan. It was on the 19th day of August, 1945, that the United States government declared official VJ Day, which was the anniversary of one of the appearances of Our Lady at Fatima. On September the 1st, 1945, the first Saturday of the month, which the Lady of Fatima asked should be consecrated to her, that General MacArthur accepted the surrender of Japan aboard the United States battleship Missouri. It was on September the 8th, 1945, the birthday of Our Lady, that the first American flag flew over Tokyo. And as it was unfurled, General MacArthur said, "Let it wave in its full glory as a symbol of victory for the right." May America continue to be under the protection of Our Lady. And while others put their trust in war, we put ours in prayer. While others want to keep the secret of the atomic bomb, we want the secret of Mary to be better known. O Lady of Victory, who has been with us in our victories in World War II, be with us in our victory over godlessness and the still greater victory of the conversion of Russia, so that when we all stand before the judgment seat of our Lord, remembering how we prayed to him through Mary, he will speak to us the most consoling words the human heart can hear. "I've heard my mother speak of you." God love you.
Well, my dear friends, I hope you enjoyed this last reflection from Fulton Sheen on Russia and Our Lady. And again, he continues to call us to pray. Pray for Russia. Continue to pray for not just the United States of America, but for the whole world. And again, the peace that comes through our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. My dear friends, I would invite you to pick up a copy of the book, Communism and the Conscience of the West, and you'll be glad you did. These audio recordings were just a sampling of what's in the book. Many of the chapters in this book are these reflections you just heard. And so, again, please feel free to continue to listen to Sheen each week on Radio Maria USA and Radio Maria Canada. Please visit me at my website, bishopsheentoday.com, and there you can enjoy hundreds of hours of free audio recordings, videos, and we've even put together a great book selection where the best-selling books available today are featured on the website. So there are a number of publishers that publish these titles. Again, I mentioned Fulton Sheen wrote close to 70 books, and many of those books are still enjoyed today. And so, again, on the website, bishopsheentoday.com, is a book section. All right, we covered a lot today, and thank you for staying with me for these hours where we enjoyed some of the wit and wisdom of Archbishop Sheen. And I will return with, again, other book reviews, and I've shared a number of Sheen's recordings from the war years, and you can find those on our YouTube channel, and of course through the website bishopsheentoday.com. And so we're here to share Sheen wherever we can. My dear friends, please pray for me, and be assured of my prayers for you. And so until the next time we meet, may the good Lord continue to bless you and keep you. May the Lord let his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. And may the Lord look upon you kindly and bring you peace. God love you.